Welcome to On the Right Side of History with Kansans for Life. Come with us as we connect the pro-life movement's past to present, uncover hidden or forgotten history, and its connections to the battle still raging today. Now, here's our host, Danielle Underwood.
Welcome back, everyone, to On the Right Side of History with Kansans for Life. Today, I have data scientist Earl Glenn with me here in the studio. Earl is a fifth-generation Kansan who has spent his career in computer programming and data analysis in a nationally recognized and respected research environment. About 20 years ago, he began noticing the media seemed to be ignoring or was maybe remaining silent about some developing trends he was seeing. So he began spending his free time and extra brain power analyzing Kansas voter data and campaign finance records. Since that obsession took hold, he's retired from his official position in the research world, but has never stopped being fascinated by the discoveries he's making, digging into hard numbers that reveal what is quietly happening around us. His outlet for all that knowledge is now channeled into his blog writing, which can be found at watchdoglab.substack.com. Welcome, Earl, and thank you for joining me here today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, this is going to be a very interesting conversation, and maybe isn't immediately apparent to some of our listeners how this intersects with the pro-life movement, but it most certainly does. And I wonder if you could tell us, how did you first get interested in digging into this information, this data?
Well, the biggest one at the beginning was I worked with Phil Klein on his Attorney General campaign, and then before that his congressional campaign. And in the Attorney General campaign, right at the end, there was just thousands of dollars spent on ads against Phil, which he ended up winning by about 0.5%, if I remember correctly. And so the idea was, where is all this money coming from behind those ads? And so I dug into it. And this was months after the election. I discovered that Dr. George Tiller in Wichita, the abortion doctor, had spent about $300,000 to defeat Phil, which was more than Phil's opponent had spent to defeat Phil. So I tried to shop that story around to different media outlets, and they just weren't interested in it. But finally, about 6 months later, one of them did pick it up, but it took 6 months of trying to get journalists to care about that story. So that was kind of the beginning of my search of these records.
So interesting. So you saw the impact that those dollars made in a race where
it almost made the final difference.
Wow. So you've kept tabs on it ever since. This has not been something that, once that interest was sparked for you, it has not let you go.
There's just lots of stories in looking at these records that nobody knows about. So
interesting. So you were frustrated by the fact that the press wasn't picking that up, wasn't running with it. Do you have any ideas about why you think that is, or just?
Well, without mentioning a particular Kansas City station, I tried to plant the seed at one of these stations, and the reporter came back and says, it's not news unless I find it first.
Oh, very interesting.
So that kind of, it means that nothing I was ever going to give him was interesting to him. So that's when I decided I had to do it myself and started blogging about things like this.
Yeah. And since you've retired from your full-time position, how many hours do you think, like a week, you're spending on either your research or your writing? Or
too many, most of them probably. I should probably do other things, but I haven't been, because it's been an election year. Actually, right after retiring, I was amazed how much stuff I'd been ignoring for like 8 years. And so that actually sparked, just who are these groups, who are these people that I hadn't heard of 8 years ago that are active in Kansas politics these days. So
okay,
it took me a while to I'm still finding things. So.
Yeah. And I think, so you have noticed then an uptick in activity of these far-left activist organizations?
Compared to 10 years ago, yes.
Yeah. Well,
they're much better funded now than they were 10 years ago. They existed, but they're much better funded.
Okay. I think that's really a perfect springboard for us to talk about that, because as I've been looking at your research and your writing, and the thing that's become immediately apparent to me, and I think is something that's not on most people's radars, is that there are massive amounts of money coming into Kansas from very well-funded people or organizations, outside influence that is pouring into Kansas. And just wondering if you could kind of explain the mechanism that's happening.
Well, one example I can think of happened right after I retired, that before the primary, the August 2022 primary, Sharice Davids, our congresswoman here in the 3rd District, had no opponent. But there were dozens and dozens of ads running as early as April or May of that year when she had no opponent, and they were all from a group called Protect Our Care. Well, where was this group coming from? And so if you go to the Secretary of State's office, it's not a Kansas business. If you go to the Attorney General's office, it's not a registered charity. So just where is that company? And so you have to go to the District of Columbia business records to find out that was a trade name of an organization in Washington, D.C. But there's just so many layers of confusion of what's going on that. So, but anyway, they spent about $350,000 on over 500 ads for Sharice just to harden her base before the primary. So they were keeping their people in line before the real election was going to happen in November.
Okay. So that's an interesting example. So then if we were going to just explain that mechanism, so what do we have happening at this funding? What is that funding mechanism? How is the money coming together? Where is that money pooling, and how is it being directed? Is it mostly through ads? Is it through other things as well?
I actually think it's through they're funding organizations, and then those organizations are finding people and doing things, and so there's just lots of money flowing into all those things.
Okay, can you explain some of those dark money groups? What do those look like?
Well, let's talk about the one the Protect Our Care group, which is one of the more curious ones. So there's a group in Washington, D.C. called the Arabella Advisors, and they manage 5 different nonprofits, and they collect huge fees for doing it. So they're becoming very wealthy by just managing these fees. You can be a person with money that you want to give it to some cause, but you don't want your name on it. So what you can do is you can give it to the Arabella Advisors, and they will spend it the way that you want them to spend it. This doesn't happen to just people like normal people in Kansas. These are often billionaires or multimillionaires that are doing this, and so they can hide their influence behind what's going on. Arabella Advisors, there's a couple funds. There's C3s and C4s, which we won't get into the weeds. But they use mechanisms to hide what's going on. 2 particular mechanisms. I mentioned earlier that Protect Our Care was a trade name that they registered in Washington, D.C. for one of their organizations. But they also do things like they have a project that's just a fiscally sponsored project. And so if you see something, I can't think of the name off the top of my head, like the Voting Lab or something like that, it may be them, but they're just saying it's a fiscally sponsored project and not really identifying who's behind it. So it's really hard to trace down the money and even who's behind some of these ads.
And we're talking huge amounts of money.
The Arabella Advisors, it's in the billions per election cycle.
Wow. That's interesting. So these are legal entities, a 501c3 and a 501c4. Many listeners are you're probably aware of those designations for organizations. And, these are, they're good in and of themselves for a nonprofit like ourselves. We have a 501c3 and we have a 501c4. And that allows us to do the work we do in Kansas. I think the major difference I would look at is, in our case, we're Kansans who are joining together to work together in a grassroots effort to move the pro-life cause forward. But that seems to me like there's an essential difference between what those kinds of organizations are doing and what our organization is doing, other than the sheer size and scope. Are there other things that you would note would be different?
Well, the confusion factor that they add to what they're doing. Like I said, they use a trade name. Well, I don't think Kansans for Life uses other trade names just to hide who they are, or they don't have projects, so they say this is a fiscally sponsored project, and then not say who the Kansans for Life is behind it. So they like to hide behind a lot of that stuff. They probably have fewer donors. They have fewer very large donors versus Kansans for Life has a number of smaller donors. Would be my guess.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I do think that's that's a very good point that you're making, because as I look at the names that you've identified as being the money pass-throughs and also then the activist organizations that end up benefiting from those dollars, so many of those names are they're very innocuously named, or what's a better way to say that?
Well, for example, the Democracy Fund. Mm-hmm. So you think that's a fund that's helping democracy. Well, Pierre Omidyar, who made all his money through eBay, that's his nonprofit. And he is as active he's not as active as George Soros, but he is active behind almost everything that happened in 2020. His money flowed into by hundreds of thousands of dollars to different groups.
In our state alone?
His money doesn't really come to our state directly. It's more he's funding groups outside our state, and those other groups will help the Kansas activists then.
Okay. So scope-wise, I mean, do you have an idea from your research roughly how many national organizations are trying to play into pushing Kansas politics in a certain far-left direction?
I don't know that many of these groups are focused on Kansas. Their focus is on the whole country and doing everything nationally. Kansas would be a cheaper state than some of the what are called battleground states. So they can spend a few $1 million here, which is a lot of money. They can have a bigger impact than it might be in some other states, say Philadelphia or Pennsylvania or Georgia or something like that. So there's dozens of national groups that are involved in this. It's not a small number.
Do you think there is a state that would be an example of how this playbook has been rolled out and maybe been more successful, or it has been kind of the model state, if you will, that they're trying to replicate in Kansas and other states as well?
They have tactics in all the battleground states. Especially if you go to Pennsylvania or Georgia or Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, all those states, things that they're doing there probably are happening or could happen in Kansas, although some things in Kansas are happening that I'm not seeing in other states either. So
I'm wondering in particular about Colorado, because I think that state has, am I correct that that's shifted? They've had a political shift in the state.
Well, there's even a book called like The Bluing of Colorado, and that's where 4 billionaire activists spent money over a period of years and took over the state. And one of those activists is now the governor of Colorado. So,
okay, that it sounds like that could.
It took him a while, but Jared Polis, he finally made it there.
Interesting. Do you think some of those same methods are being applied in our state?
Pretty much. I mean, they fund activists to do things, but the two things they're really looking for are voter registration and getting out the vote. And I call it shepherding. They more shepherd their people to the polls than some of the things. Like I don't think the ballot harvesting and everything that's happening in other states is happening in Kansas, or it's happening to a very minor extent. We aren't seeing those things, but just they are talking to their people. They're sending them the reminders of deadlines. They're giving them, text messages, email messages, and they're just much better getting their people focused on getting to the polls on time. And we just let everybody do their own thing, and so they're just more effective than we are.
That's an interesting word you're using, shepherding.
Yeah.
So that essentially says to me that they are taking tactics, maybe they're psychology-based tactics, or they're, some kind of social pressure tactics that they are applying to people who maybe otherwise wouldn't be voting?
Well, you say that, but there's actually a group that was probably 15 years old called the Analyst Institute. It has the same address as the AFL-CIO in Washington, D.C., and they do social science research on what makes elections work. And then they've done consulting since then, and that's exactly what they're doing. They're trying to find out what makes elections work from their perspective.
Okay, so you're saying they are using psychology.
There's a group that does that. Well, so Analyst Institute does social science research. There's another group called Catalyst that they buy voter registration data. They've been doing this 10, 15 years, but it's always the voter registration data largely for nonprofits. So why do nonprofits need that voter registration data? They're always motivating their voter base to show up, to register to vote, to request those advance ballots, and then to show up at the polls.
Okay, so even more than shepherding, I almost would think that's like hand-holding.
Well, I'm just using shepherding as my analogy.
Okay, so let's talk about the pro-life movement in this larger far-left activist movement. what do you know? And, I know some things, and I'm wondering what you know in terms of their goals for abortion in this country.
Basically, they want no rules of any kind. I don't remember names off the top of my head, but there are groups and people that are trying to make that happen. Just remove all restrictions of any kind.
Yeah. So we're talking. One of their stated goals is abortion available anytime for any reason up to the moment of birth. And beyond that, they also want those to be paid for by our taxpayer dollars. They want free abortions.
Yes.
On demand. And we have to realize that this is a major part of their platform, if you will. I don't know if platform's the right word, but it's what they're pushing for.
There are some groups, obviously, that is their only and primary and only focus. But there's other groups that one of the Arabella advisor funds focuses on such issues. So for example, Trust Women in Wichita has received money from like $900,000 a couple years ago from one of the dark money sources in D.C. through that. So they don't have a primary focus, but it's one of their secondary things that they fund. But other places like NARAL and other national groups, they're 100%.
Yeah, and then again, kind of back to what we were just talking about before that, they love to apply these words to them so that they sound so beautiful, right? The reproductive justice, right? And healthcare rights, that kind of, painting this picture, just like you were saying about the Democracy Project. It sounds wonderful. It sounds like something we should all be behind. And yet it's really a mask for these far left policies that are not palatable to most people. When we look at the data of public opinion on abortion, and when most people think that it should be limited by, so you're looking at just the middle section of the American public, most people agree that there should be a limit, so that for example, late-term abortions are completely unpalatable to most people, but yet these far left organizations, that is their stated purpose, and then either it's their stated purpose or they're allied in some way with the groups who that is their stated purpose.
Yes, that happens a lot.
Yeah. So this is really interesting. If we're talking about these dark money groups where they're either funded by maybe several very wealthy individuals or a whole group of very wealthy individuals that are trying to combine their dollars and really exert influence in other states that are not their home state, but with the express purpose of pushing states into a much more far left type of environment and legal environment as well.
Well, one thing I can think of that along those lines is there was a group of Stanford University professors that got together, and it was MTG. It was Mind the Gap, and so they got a number of people. They weren't super wealthy, but they were wealthy, and they got them to channel their money to groups like Voter Participation Center and Center for Voting Information, which in Kansas then resulted in 1.5 million pieces mailed to Kansas voters last year in 2022, and 1 million of those were just to get out the vote in November. So it's weird how we really can't trace the money. We know the stories. They take credit. That is their stated goal. That was one of their purposes, was to help Sharice Davids and Laura Kelly get reelected, and that's what they're trying to do. And you would think that 1 million voting pieces might have resulted in the 20,000 vote difference that Laura Kelly won by, or 22,000.
That's a lot of mail.
Yes.
A lot of mail. So now that we've kind of covered where that money is starting from and the organizations that are the pass-through or directing the money, where's that money going to? Let's talk about that part of this discussion.
Well, one of them that you hear a lot about is ACLU. The ACLU Kansas will go to bat and sue for almost any reason. So one of the cases related to that earlier case that I talked about all those mailings coming into Kansas, the Secretary of State and the attorney, or not, the district attorney here in Johnson County, are trying to stop some of that by putting some roadblocks in place. But they went to court and they lost that decision because that was those people's First Amendment right to do that. And so right now they can pre-fill out an application form and send it to everybody without any restrictions, even if the information on it's wrong, because they have free speech rights. So it's like, is it free speech or is it election administration? So these are nonprofit groups, and the ACLU Kansas is the primary one behind those lawsuits. Another group is called Loud Light, and their focus is on registering the youth of Kansas, or anybody like 35 or less. And so they're quite active on all the Kansas campuses with college kids. And then they have other projects, like there's a special project they have going on in southwest Kansas in the rural areas. So lots of activities by these groups.
Yeah, and I hope that we can, for those of you who are listening on audio podcasts, you might be interested in jumping into the video side of this too, because, I think I'd love to just go ahead and insert you have a wonderful graphic that shows the multitude of smaller nonprofit organizations that are working within Kansas. And maybe that's an informal network of activists, but, working through, you just mentioned a few examples. When you look at the full picture, it's kind of staggering to see how many of these organizations have popped up under, again, very, very friendly sounding names, very, democracy and rights this and all kinds of, you could rattle off the names, and that's not necessarily the intention here. But I think we'll throw up a quick slide of that and just let people see some of these organizations you may have heard of in your local area. Some of them are more based in the Wichita area, the Overland Park area. Some of them are tied to school board races, but they all have similar and aligned purposes, and they tend to at least somehow informally network together. And how is that happening? Have you been able to find any evidence of collaboration?
Well, they host meetings, and then it's the same on both sides, that like minds show up at some of the same meetings. So they have meetings across the state to promote, even voter registration or even like candidates. They have meetings to help recruit candidates. So they're not really doing anything different than we are, but they're just much more organized. Okay. For example, I recently studied all of Soros's money and all of Pierre Omidyar's money from the Democracy Fund for the last few years. They've already spent money in 2023 for the 2024 election. There's a bigger expenditure money last year than this year from there, because they've planned it. They know what they're going to do, and it's already in place. We're scrambling now just on our side to what are we going to do this year to make things happen. So they're very well organized, and their timing is very good.
And they've spent money in what ways? What do we need to be aware of that they are already doing?
The things I talked about, like Loud Light, they've had ads in the last couple of days. They're trying to recruit new people to manage their money, because they have more people that are going to be working for them across the state on voter registration and getting out the vote. So I know they have more money. I don't know what they're going to do with it yet, though.
So they're definitely ramping up their efforts.
Yes.
Heading into this year.
Yeah, job ads are usually a pretty good sign.
That's good. And you're monitoring job ads as well.
Well, if you follow things on Twitter, all sorts of things pop up there that you wouldn't find out otherwise.
That's a good point. Yeah, when you're paying attention, those dots tend to get connected. But it's just that most everyday people are not paying attention to that kind of information. If it's not on our radar, I think that's why this conversation is really important, because it does tie back to the influence they're going to try to exert on this next election cycle. And we've got to get busy. We've always been busy, but I think we're realizing we've got to get busier. We need to be, let's go ahead and shift our conversation now, because if we're talking about, it's easy when you start to hear about this huge amounts of money coming into our state and the amount of infrastructure that's been built through that money, which it is a definite, that's an advantage on their side. We have to recognize that. But all hope is not lost. Let's talk about what do we need to be doing right now?
Well, one of the things they're doing right now is they're trying to identify people that don't vote all the time, and trying to engage those people and say, why aren't you in part of the voting process? We could do that very easily on our side. Talk to your neighbors, talk to them about issues, find out what really they're concerned about, and explain how maybe voting can help with some of their day-to-day concerns. besides that, we need to get involved in some groups that can kind of maybe help more than one single person could do. So there's just lots of organizations you can get involved with. Start your own if you can't find one in your area, though.
That's great. Yeah, I think too many of us, we get very busy in our everyday lives. We're, either we're running kids to baseball, or we're, taking care of a parent who's aging, or, maybe we're just really involved in our job. So many things that fill our time, and we think, well, Kansas is a conservative state, and it's going to continue to be a good state because we've got good people here, but we cannot outsource this effort to other people anymore. We're going to have to, all of us are going to need to engage in this, or we're going to very possibly really lose some of our, just the conservativeness of our state if we just sit on the sidelines and we don't engage. So I think you're so right. We've got to be busy and do something this time. More than absolutely vote, but more than that, we need to get involved well in advance of any kind of campaigns that even begin, so that we can network with people and start to find the different gifts that we have within our network and make sure that we're utilizing those gifts. Is there anything else you think is important for people to know?
Well, one thing I can think of is when you get a political mailing, or even you see an ad on TV, don't believe any part of it until you really study who's behind the ad and why they're doing it. Lots of people just take these things for gospel truth, and there's an agenda behind it that you don't necessarily understand. It's often hard to find out who's behind it, but don't just take these things on face value. The media is not any better. They really don't explain what's going on very well. So it's kind of hard to find out what the truth is these days.
And I think you even found from some of your research that some of that quote unquote media is actually funded by these mechanisms.
There are all these sources. Soros, Pierre Omidyar, other sources are funding lefty media all across the country. That's a big. I haven't done a specific story on that, but there's lots of dollars going into that.
Yeah, so let's talk about that, because I think that that's something that most Kansans really are unaware of. I think most people are starting to realize you have to very carefully look at what you're reading, what you're seeing on TV, and understanding that, even if you're being told that it's just the facts, there is some bias behind it. But what you're talking about, this mechanism here, these news reports that are being published by one particular outlet and then being distributed to other papers throughout the state for free, from what I have heard. I guess I should be wary to say that.
That you basically invite people to republish your stuff. I mean, they do it, we do it. Yes, that happens.
And as Kansas newsrooms have shrunk, and the smaller papers, the smaller cities and towns, they haven't been able to keep as large of a staff on their their writers, and so I think they do welcome that kind of content. They're looking for information that they can share with their readers about what's happening at the State House, not realizing, at least the readers on the other end of that see that coming from their hometown paper, that the source of that information is actually from one of these funded organizations.
Or candidates do that too. When you see a candidate appear, they orchestrate an event just so they can appear on camera. So I see that all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think even more, other listeners may have heard. So we did a recent podcast where we talked about bias in the media and how the Associated Press has moved language to slant news stories against the pro-life movement.
Oh, exactly. That's happened for years.
It has happened for years, but it's ramping up. In the last 2 years, essentially, they've made two major changes within that AP style book, that guidebook that they give to all journalists. Most writers do write to their standards. So that's happening, but this is even further beyond that. This is talking about the subject that they're going to be covering, the topic, the angle that they're going to cover it from, and really the unstated goal of that supposed news story is to really change the minds of the readers in Kansas about pro-life topics. Is that?
Yeah, you haven't seen a pro-life article on Kansas Reflector yet. So.
No, we haven't. Well, we're just looking for a fair article.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So this is all really important information. I think if we've got to wake up and realize that there is these informal networks have the express purpose of trying to influence our elections, our culture, our state. And, first of all, awareness is the first step for all of us. Beginning to question what, just like you said, you get that postcard and it says one thing, but how could they be misconstruing true information to influence you? I think that that's a really important, developing that discernment when you're digesting any kind of media, whether that's print, TV, radio in our state, national as well. I think that's one of the reasons, that's really a huge reason that we started this podcast, is because we realized that there was not a good way to talk directly with the people. We even realized we were being suppressed on social media, trying to communicate with people within our state. And the First Amendment, the ability to speak your perspective and argue your points and help people understand the truth is so essential to being able to have a functioning civil society. And so that's why we started this podcast, because we wanted people to have access to your information. You're giving away your research and your writing. That's free to anyone who would be interested in digging into this.
And I must apologize. It's usually overly technical and overly detailed, but if the information is nowhere else to be found, so I'm trying to prove that I'm not making this stuff up. There are documents that say what I'm trying to say. So
I think that's a beautiful part of what you do, is that you're very meticulous in your documentation. And that's really essential. We've got to be above board. We've got to be above the standard that others tend to follow. We've got to make sure that we are very clear in what we're communicating, and that we're giving people good factual information. That's what we try to do at Kansans for Life. We want to make sure that we're giving good information to people. So so if people do decide that they would like to learn more, tell them, what are they going to find from your Substack?
I write different articles. I am somewhat monopolistic. If something comes up that I find, I'll write a story about it. So the other day, there was a story about, ACLU Kansas was bragging about what they had done in 2023, but one of them was getting ballots to the people in the Johnson County prisons, which I thought was, is that your focus? So I do turn little things like that into quick stories. Other ones take weeks and weeks to research. There's still a story about what's called integrated voter engagement that the Kansas Health Foundation is behind. They spent over $5 million over from 2017 to through even next year, and nobody knows about what they're doing with that money. So it's just, I'm trying to get all the I's dotted and the T's crossed, and just finding all the information is hard to get. So I write stories about campaign finance. I write stories about voter data problems. Like, there's a lot of people that want to improve that data. Yes, it needs to be improved, but we seem to be blocked by a lot of mostly federal laws that we can't make some changes in that. So yes, it's overly technical, but I will try to connect dots back to sources of money in most of these articles.
Okay. That's very interesting stuff. And I know that you have other topics that we would like to dig deeper into in future episodes of this podcast. I think that there are some important examples people need to see, real world examples of how this pattern is playing out in our state, and how that is coming through sources they would not expect to be involved in political issues, doing it under the guise of, just kind of those layers of masquerade, if you will, so that people don't realize what's truly being, who is pushing certain angles on them. Yes. So I'm really glad that you brought up the get out the vote effort that we've got to all engage in at this point. We've got to get connected.
Talk to your friends.
Yes, and also connected in more formal and informal. So informal ways, those conversations, letting people know that as members of the pro-life movement, that we've got to be engaged this time. that we have to make sure that we also get tied into formal networks as well. That people can always, they should be watching what we're putting out too, so we can keep people informed about what's happening. We're a nonpartisan organization. We are an issue-based organization. And so we're going to be always giving that kind of information to people. I also think that you so that also ties into your recommendation to do capacity building, that needs to become a more particular focus.
So the wealthy people that have the resources need to get together and decide what they could do to help stop what's going on in Kansas. Maybe we could pay some of our youth to go off and do these things. That would counter some of what's going on. Use your talents, use your resources in a way that might help.
Mm-hmm. And we've brought on interns at our organization. They've been wonderful. But, being able to expand that program, I think, would be fantastic. If somebody wanted to help move that forward, we could certainly be partnering with them on it. I think that's a great idea. So I have learned so much from this conversation, and I know our listeners have too. So in coming weeks, I really would like to dig into this further and just shine a light on real world examples of how this is affecting pro-life efforts in Kansas and elsewhere. So on behalf of Kansans for Life, thank you, Earl, for the work you're doing. Thank you. Yep. Thank you for the writing you're doing. I just wanted to remind everyone that you can find his citizen journalism. That's kind of a big word. You are a citizen journalist. That's what I would, and researcher. You can find it at watchdoglab.substack.com. And if you want to stay up to date on this and all pro-life topics, please visit kfl.org to sign up and receive our updates. That's kfl.org. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, now called X, Instagram, and even TikTok at Kansans for Life. You can find us on YouTube, too. Many of you are watching this podcast there. So remember to subscribe. If you would, please recommend this podcast to your friends. If you found something that was interesting that you think is worth sharing, maybe you learned something today that was not something at all on your radar and you wanted others to know about it too. Please share this and leave us a comment, leave a review. And as we say goodbye, we do this every time, never forget, the pro-life movement is on the right side of history. Truth always wins in the end. We hope you'll join us next time. Thank you.